May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Do you think people can be compelled to love, or is it the kind of thing that can only be done when it's chosen? A couple of years ago, a friend of mine, a professional educator, told me about some interesting early childhood research that may speak a little bit to that question, especially if we think about the part of love that lives in the acts of service we do for each other. Making kids share causes hoarding, my friend Dory told me. What do you mean? I answered. That seems counterintuitive. I was sitting there in that moment trying to count how many times I had told children to share over the years. I know, she said, I felt the same way when somebody first said that to me, and then I saw it in action. Dory had been visiting another school doing observations of children, and she sat down next to two little boys on a carpet who were playing Legos. And each one was sort of working side by side on his own structure, and they were happily playing along, and Dory was watching them. And she noticed that one of the little boys was only using the red and green Legos. He didn't want any other colors, only the red and green. And the other boy was using all the colors. And she kept watching as the level of the Legos in the bin between them got lower and lower and lower. And she kept looking at their structures and thinking neither of them looked anywhere near complete and wondering what was going to happen. Finally, the little boy of the red and green structure looked into the bin and realized all of the red and green Legos were gone. And he got that look on his face like, what am I going to do? I'm about to lose it. And Dory leaned in to say to the other little boy, can you share some Legos with your friend? And she noticed that the other little boy had already clocked what was going on. He could already tell what was happening. And he saw in her face what was coming, the request to give up some of his own Legos. And he had quietly started to pile his Legos together and move them to the other side of his body where they would not be quite so obvious to anybody else. And Dory noticed what was happening and remembered what she had just been taught about hoarding. And she looked instead at the other little boy, the one of the red and green structure, and she said to him, oh, you only need the red and green Legos, right? And he nodded his head. And the second little boy, she could see out of the corner of her eye, she could see him take a deep breath like, oh, well, that's not so hard. And he nodded his head. And he quietly moved his Legos back over to the middle and started sorting through them for the red and the green ones to give to his friend. Making kids share causes hoarding, Dory repeated to me. It makes kids fear scarcity. It makes us think that there isn't enough. What works better is reminding them that there is enough for everyone, helping them to learn to look around at the world and see what their friends might need or what the people around them might need. And then teaching them to look at what they have that they could offer. Then they can think of what they could want to share rather than being afraid and focused on what it is they might lose. For Joseph, I think the fear is kind of a combination between what he's going to lose and what he's going to gain. Matthew tells us that Joseph fears the loss of his reputation, his place in the community, the good opinion of others. But anybody who's ever helped to raise a child or been responsible for one for an afternoon or longer will tell you that Joseph's greater fear was almost certainly the fullness of the responsibility that was being placed on his head. Imagine it. Raise this child. By the way, he's God's child. Try not to mess that up. Provide for him, protect him, encourage him, admonish him, teach him, love him. And I think Joseph wondered, do I have what it takes? to do this? He can't imagine that he will, and he can't yet picture the way that he will love this child. He can't yet imagine that moment when he realizes that the love of this child will outstrip most everything else that he fears. Not that he won't fear anything again, but that the love will make it worth it. And he can't imagine that there will be love and support and help that will show up just when he needs them in ways he can't dream would be possible. Throughout this season, many of you know that I've been reading for you stories written by Roger Robinault from a book called Unicorn at the Manger, Animal Stories of the Holy Night. So I want to invite you to step again into one of his chapters, and we'll hear it together. The first part kind of is the preamble to the story. You'll remember that he's got a relationship with the unicorn, who was the first crazy animal to go into the creche. And then the second part is the story that he tells the children on Christmas Eve. The Goat Who Gave. Ted and Marita had come to my study to discuss a Christmas Eve baptism. The baby cried loudly. The unicorn grimaced as he peered around a large Bible on my desk. Marita cast a worried look at the 2-week-old infant son in her arms. I was so ill when he was born. I haven't been able to nurse him. We're still struggling to find the proper formula. He seems hungry all the time. She laughed nervously. My father said I should get myself a goat. There was a sound of a sharp intake of breath from the direction of the desk. I finished my conference with the parents, assuring them that I was not concerned about a crying baby on Christmas Eve. The first Christmas Eve had its own tears, at least in my stories, I said. They laughed. At the sound of their joy, the baby stopped crying. When I was alone with the unicorn, I asked him, what kind of fuss were you making during my meeting? He looked at me innocently and said, I wasn't making a fuss. I was merely clearing my throat. Is it against office etiquette for a unicorn to clear his throat? The telephone rang, and I was spared further pursuit of the silly conversation. I forgot all about it until Christmas Eve, when the children gathered around me in the chancel with the creche and its beasts before us. Eyes glistened in candlelight as I unwrapped this season's offering. It was a full-uddered milk goat. I glanced at the unicorn. He was grinning broadly, and then he whispered this story to me. The cow would not, I repeat, would not allow the goat into her stable. She felt the goat was repellingly odoriferous, but her terrible smell was not her only shortcoming in the cow's eyes. She simply knew nothing about child rearing. Cows' calves and the goat's kids were studies in contrast. Calves were models of discipline, filling their days with strictly patterned activity under the iron-handed direction of their mother. The kids, on the other hand, leapt about with unbridled joy, celebrating sunshine and reveling in rain, while the goat looked on with rare aplomb, knowing that she would teach them to love and to care within the framework of exaltation. The goat and her kids were banished to a shallow hillside cave far across the field from the stable. It was often a little bit lonely. However, they were assured of one bright spot every day, a visit from the innkeeper's daughter, who would arrive with her wide-mouthed stone jar to strip milk from the goat. She would play games with the kids and spend a bit of time scratching the goat's ears. Cow was jealous as she observed this activity from afar, but her general superiority made her certain that the innkeeper's daughter just had very bad taste when it came to livestock. As the city of Bethlehem filled with people and the inn filled with guests, the innkeeper's daughter served the goat's rich milk to those gathered around her tables. The cow was producing no milk at that moment of the year. When the heavens filled with angelic voices and a great light, the goat rushed her kids to the top of a low hill so they might remember the holy night as long as they lived. They saw, silhouetted against the starlight, arriving shepherds and questing kings. They felt for the time being that they were the center of the universe. Strange activity was centered on the stable. Leaving the kids to play King of the Mountain, the goat decided to violate the cow's edict of separation and creep closer for a look. As she approached, she heard the wailing of an infant and the weeping of an exhausted mother. The woman choked out words between her sobs. "Oh, Joseph, I feel like I'm failing. I'm so tired and I have no more milk to give, but he's hungry." Joseph took the baby from its mother's arms, trying to comfort him and saying, "Rest for a little while, Mary. Maybe the milk will come then." Some shepherds were just entering the stable at that moment. The goat quickly huddled in their midst, hoping the cow would not notice her. She slipped closer to the manger. Joseph had carried the baby to an open rear door to shield Mary from its outcries. The goat noticed the large block from which soldiers in full armor mounted and dismounted their horses. With a graceful leap, she was on the block. If the man would only notice her, he might remember the value of goat's milk for babies when the mother's milk is delayed. She bleated softly to draw his attention. He looked first at her full udder and then at his sobbing son. He mused, maybe it would work. He folded his cloak on the block by the goat and laid the baby on it. The child's cries became more shrill. Joseph gently reached for the goat and stripped out a bit of milk on his finger. The baby sucked greedily. Joseph milked a bit more into the palm of his hand and let the warm, saving liquid run down the eagerly suckled finger. After 2 palmfuls of milk, the baby fell asleep on the folded cloak. Joseph nestled his infant son in his arms. Across the stable, the cow saw the goat standing still as a statue on the mounting block. She snorted, "Miserable show-off. I'll have her thrown out of my stable yard before she can say Caesar Augustus." However, as the cow approached the block, she saw Joseph put his arm around the goat's neck. The nanny goat gently nuzzled the infant's soft cheek. The cow heard Joseph say, "Goat, my dear goat, blessed are you among all creatures. You've nurtured our son and should be ever praised. Stay here among us." The goat replied quietly, "I have family to care for on the far hillside, but I'll come again tomorrow to see if I'm needed." She leaped from the block. As she turned, the light from the great star transformed her horns into burnished gold. She walked to the edge of its light, then she disappeared into the night. The cow was dumbfounded. The mere goat was to be blessed and praised? What a ridiculous idea. And then she saw the quiet baby cradled in his father's arms, and she knew that something of a miracle had happened. And the cow decided that on a strange night when the whole world was topsy-turvy, even the goat could make a miracle. When I retrieved the unicorn after the service, he snuggled down into the palm of my hand and commented, "I hope I surprised you with the story. I doubted you remembered the conversation with Ted and Marita in your office." I had forgotten, I admitted. I wanted all the stories I could find about the surprising places where compassion is alive. That's what the Holy Eve is really all about. The unicorn's eyelids were beginning to droop. I slipped him into my pocket. Peace reigned once more, at least for the moment. We can all relate at times to the fears of the cow. That something of our own specialness will be lost if the specialness of someone else is honored. The angel and the goat remind us that there is room enough for all, that love makes more of itself, and somehow our hearts just grow as big as they need to be. We don't have to be afraid, because love is coming into the world to be held in our arms and passed around between us, to lie sleeping on our chests, hearing the beats of our hearts, which grow impossibly larger and possibly fuller with each moment. We don't have to be afraid. We only have to look around, see compassion, and imagine all the love that is to come. Amen.